A knock in the cold. The grandfather clock in Charles Whittaker's mansion struck 6, its deep chimes resonating through the vast, silent halls. Outside, a relentless winter storm raged, blanketing the city in thick layers of snow. The cold December wind howled through the towering oak trees that lined the mansion's iron gates, carrying with it a biting chill that would seep into the bones of anyone caught unprepared. Inside, the warmth of the grand dining hall stood in stark contrast to the blizzard outside. A long mahogany table stretched down the length of the room, adorned with an elaborate Christmas feast that remained untouched. A perfectly roasted turkey, creamy mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and golden rolls sat under the glow of an extravagant chandelier. Yet, Charles sat alone at the head of the table, his posture rigid, his expression void of the usual satisfaction he once felt in his solitude. The flames in the grand fireplace flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls lined with antique paintings and family portraits. He swirled the whiskey in his glass, watching as the amber liquid caught the firelight. He took a slow sip, the burn doing little to ease the ache in his chest. Another year gone, another Christmas spent in an empty house. His once lively home had long since been reduced to this hollow grandeur, expensive and elegant yet devoid of warmth. His ex-wife had left him over a decade ago. His children, estranged, distant, caught in their own worlds, no longer reaching out. And then there was her, Lila. Her name alone carried a weight that pressed on his chest like a stone. Lila Johnson had been the one thing in his life that wasn't about money, business, or power. She had been laughter in the quiet, color in the dull monotony of high society life. She had been real, and yet he had let her go. He closed his eyes, trying to drown out the memories, but they came unbidden. The way she used to sketch in the margins of restaurant napkins, how she would hum when she cooked, the gentle way she touched his hand when she thought no one was looking. He remembered how she had looked at him, back when he was still worthy of love. A sharp knock at the front door jolted him from his thoughts. He frowned. No one visited him. Not anymore. Another knock, more insistent this time. Setting down his whiskey, he rose from the table, his footsteps echoing through the grand hall as he made his way toward the entrance. The security gates were locked, and the driveway was nearly impassable due to the heavy snowfall. Who could possibly be here? When he pulled open the heavy oak door, a blast of icy wind rushed inside, stealing the warmth from the foyer. And there, standing on his doorstep, was a boy, no older than 12. Thin, small, wrapped in a tattered coat that did little to shield him from the freezing cold. His sneakers, worn and soaked through, left dark patches on the marble steps. His dark skin had taken on a sickly ashen hue from the cold, and his lips trembled violently. Please, sir," the boy stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can I just stay inside for a moment? Just to warm up?" Charles's fingers tightened around the brass doorknob. He scanned the surrounding property, eyes narrowing against the snowfall. Was this a trick? Some scam? A distraction while an accomplice waited in the shadows? "Who sent you?" Charles demanded, his voice sharper than intended. The boy shivered but didn't retreat. His shoulders hunched further against the wind as he lowered his gaze. "My mom," he whispered. "She told me, if I was ever in trouble, to find Charles Whittaker." Charles's heart lurched. He stiffened. "Your mother's name?" The boy hesitated, his chapped lips parting as if the very words pained him. Then, with a voice laced with something deeper than mere desperation, he answered, "Lila." The world around Charles seemed to still. The storm raged on, but the sound of the wind faded into the background. The whiskey in his veins turned to ice. His grip on the doorframe tightened. Lila. His mind struggled to process the impossibility of it. The boy before him, standing in the snow with pleading eyes, wasn't just some lost child. He was her son, and somehow, he was Charles's son too. The ghosts of yesterday, The wind howled through the estate grounds, whispering past the iron gates and up the marble steps where Jeremiah stood trembling. His breath came in short, visible puffs, his thin arms wrapped tightly around his frail body, clutching his tattered coat as if the fabric alone could shield him from the relentless winter. Charles could not move. The boy's words hung in the cold air like a ghost that refused to fade. Lila. His mind whirled, struggling to reconcile the child before him with the past he had so carefully buried. Lila's son. No, it couldn't be. His son. That was impossible. But when he looked at the boy again, really looked, he saw it, the shape of his eyes, the delicate curve of his cheek, the unspoken strength in his small frame. Echoes of Lila. Echoes of himself. And yet, his walls refused to crumble. The years of hardened detachment from anything beyond business and wealth had made it difficult for emotions to take root. If this was a trick, he needed to know now. His voice, despite the turmoil inside, came out firm. How do you know that name? Jeremiah shifted on his feet, his teeth chattering so hard he could barely get the words out. She was my mom, he whispered, his voice cracking like ice under pressure. She got sick, and she made me promise. She said, if I ever needed help, I should find you. Silence stretched between them. The fire crackled softly from the distant hearth, casting flickering light into the foyer, but Charles felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the snow. His mind screamed at him to shut the door, to walk away, to preserve the life he had built. But Lila's eyes were staring back at him. The boy swayed slightly, his lips trembling, his fingers nearly blue. And something inside Charles snapped. Come inside, he said, the words out before he could stop them. Jeremiah hesitated, as if he had expected to be turned away. But Charles had already made his decision. The boy stepped over the threshold, his small, soaked sneakers leaving wet footprints across the pristine marble floor. Charles shut the heavy oak door behind them, sealing out the storm. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Charles turned on his heel. Follow me. The first night. The mansion was a kingdom of wealth and excess, yet Jeremiah stood in the hallway like an intruder in a foreign land. His small frame seemed dwarfed by the grandeur. The towering crystal chandeliers, the gold-trimmed wallpaper, the elaborate paintings that lined the walls. The warmth of the house hit him like a blow. After days of biting cold, it almost felt painful. His fingers, numb and stiff, burned as the blood slowly returned to them. Charles walked ahead of him, his footsteps slow, measured. You need food. Jeremiah didn't argue. His stomach clenched painfully at the thought of a real meal. He hadn't eaten since the previous morning, surviving only on a half-eaten granola bar he had found in the pocket of his too-thin jacket. The dining hall was still set from earlier in the evening, untouched plates of Christmas dishes spread across the long table, silverware gleaming under the chandelier. Charles motioned toward a chair. Sit. Jeremiah hesitated. He wasn't sure he was allowed to. But the smell of food was overwhelming. Hunger clawed at him like a desperate animal, and finally he pulled the heavy wooden chair back and sank into it. Charles reached for a serving spoon and, with surprising ease, scooped roasted turkey onto a plate, followed by mashed potatoes, green beans, and a golden dinner roll. Jeremiah stared at the food in front of him, his stomach twisting with both gratitude and unease. People had only ever given him food out of pity. What did Charles Whittaker want in return? Eat, Charles said simply. Jeremiah obeyed. The first bite made his eyes burn. It had been so long since he'd had a hot meal. He tried to pace himself, to use proper manners, but once he started, he couldn't stop. The warmth of the food spread through him like fire, chasing away the last remnants of the bitter cold. Charles watched him carefully, his fingers steepled under his chin. When did she die? He asked suddenly. Jeremiah's spoon halted midair. The question came out too sharp, too raw. But there was something underneath it, something even Jeremiah could sense. Regret. She got sick last year, Jeremiah said quietly, pushing a piece of turkey around his plate. We didn't have insurance, and the hospital sent her home because we couldn't pay. Charles's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. She worked at a diner, you know. Jeremiah continued, his voice faltering. She'd come home late every night. She always said she was saving up for us to get out of that place. But he swallowed hard. She never got the chance. The room seemed to shrink. Charles exhaled slowly, the weight of his past pressing down on him. He had been oblivious to all of it. While he sat in luxury, Lila had been dying in poverty. You didn't know, Jeremiah said suddenly, almost as if reading his mind. Did you? Charles shook his head, his voice hollow. No. Jeremiah looked down at his plate, his hands tightening into fists. Then why didn't you ever come back for us? The words were quiet, but they cut deeper than anything else had. Charles looked away, unable to answer. A room of his own. After dinner, Charles led Jeremiah up a long spiral staircase, down a hallway lined with doors. He pushed one open. This was my son's room. Jeremiah peered inside. The room was untouched, frozen in time. The bed was neatly made, the books on the shelf untouched. Charles hesitated. He doesn't live here anymore. Jeremiah's brows furrowed, but he didn't ask why. Instead, he shuffled inside, hesitant but curious. The walls were painted a deep navy blue, speckled with glow-in-the-dark stars. A desk sat in the corner, cluttered with untouched school supplies. A telescope faced the large bay window. Charles placed a folded pile of fresh clothes on the bed. You can sleep here. Jeremiah hesitated. He had slept in shelters, in alleyways, on benches in frozen parks. He had never slept here, somewhere warm, safe, real. Finally, he nodded. As Charles turned to leave, Jeremiah found himself calling out, "Thank you." Charles didn't turn around, but he paused, just for a moment. Then, he nodded and shut the door. The letter. Charles retreated to his study, pouring himself another whiskey as he paced the floor. His mind was a storm. Lila. His son. His son. The weight of those words felt suffocating. His fingers traced the edge of a locked drawer in his desk. With a slow, measured breath, he pulled it open. Inside was a small wooden box. His hands trembled as he lifted the lid. A letter lay inside. Lila's handwriting. The ink had faded slightly with time, but the words were unmistakable. He had never opened it, had never been brave enough. His breath caught as he unfolded the paper. Dearest Charles, you once told me love was about choices. You chose wealth. You chose power. You chose a life without me. But I need you to know something. You also chose to leave behind your son. His name is Jeremiah, and one day he might come looking for you. Please, for the love you once claimed to have for me, choose him, even if it's too late for us. Lila. The whiskey glass slipped from Charles's fingers, shattering against the floor. He sank into his chair, his breath unsteady. His past had come knocking at his door, and this time he would not turn it away. The weight of the past. The heavy silence of the mansion stretched across the halls like a ghost that refused to leave. The broken whiskey glass lay forgotten on the floor, amber liquid seeping into the fine Persian rug. Charles Whittaker sat slumped in his leather chair, Lila's letter trembling in his fingers, its words cutting through him like a blade. You once told me love was about choices. You chose wealth. You chose power. You chose a life without me. But I need you to know something. You also chose to leave behind your son. His name is Jeremiah, and one day he might come looking for you. Please, for the love you once claimed to have for me, choose him. His breath was shallow, uneven. How long had this letter sat here, unread? How many years had he spent convincing himself that his past didn't matter, that his choices hadn't left scars on people who once loved him? Now, a child, their child, was upstairs in a bedroom he should have grown up in. A boy who had walked through a snowstorm just to find a father he didn't even know. Charles squeezed his eyes shut. The weight of regret settled on his chest like a stone. He had done this. He had left Lila to struggle alone, had chosen his father's approval over love, had walked away without once looking back. But now he had a choice, a father's hesitation. Upstairs, Jeremiah lay curled in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling. The room was too quiet, too perfect. He felt like a guest in someone else's life, like he had stumbled into a dream that wasn't meant for him. The blankets were warm, but he couldn't shake the chill that had settled into his bones. Could he really trust Charles Whittaker? His mother had spoken about him only a handful of times. She never sounded angry, only sad. He wasn't strong enough, she had whispered once, when she thought Jeremiah was asleep. But that doesn't mean he wasn't good. Jeremiah had carried those words with him for years, trying to understand them. But now, sitting in this house, a house so big and empty it felt more like a museum than a home, he wasn't sure what to believe. Would Charles send him away once he realized he wasn't the son he wanted? Or worse, what if he didn't care at all? Jeremiah turned on his side, pulling the blanket tighter around himself. He was used to disappointment, used to being shuffled from place to place, used to people looking at him like a burden. Maybe this would be the same. But deep down, he needed, to believe that for once, someone would choose to stay. The morning after, Charles woke early, exhaustion clinging to his body. He found himself standing outside the bedroom door before he even realized he had moved. For a long moment, he simply stood there, his hand hovering over the doorknob. What was he even doing? He had spent years closing himself off, turning away from emotions that felt too raw, too dangerous. And yet, here he was, hesitating outside a child's room like an uncertain man who no longer knew his own reflection. Finally, he exhaled and knocked. Silence. He knocked again. Slowly, the door creaked open, and Jeremiah stood there, his hair slightly tousled, his dark eyes wary. I made breakfast, Charles said awkwardly. Jeremiah blinked at him. Okay. Neither of them moved. Charles cleared his throat. You do eat breakfast, right? A flicker of something, not quite amusement, not quite trust, crossed Jeremiah's face. Yeah. Charles stepped back. Then come on. An unlikely breakfast. The kitchen was a place Charles rarely used. His housekeeper, Mrs. Peterson, usually handled everything, but this morning he had sent the staff home early. Jeremiah stood near the counter, watching as Charles cracked eggs into a pan. It was obvious he wasn't used to cooking. The first egg slid out of the shell like a crime scene. Jeremiah bit his lip to keep from laughing. Charles scowled at the mess, then glanced at the boy. What? Jeremiah shrugged. Nothing. Charles huffed, trying again. This time, the eggs landed in the pan mostly intact. He flipped a pancake, badly, but after a few attempts, the stack grew into something that actually resembled food. When they sat down at the kitchen island, the tension between them wasn't as thick as it had been the night before. Jeremiah hesitated, then took a bite of the pancake. He chewed, his expression unreadable. Charles shifted uncomfortably. Well, Jeremiah swallowed. Then, very seriously, he said, "It's not the worst thing I've ever eaten." Silence. Then, to Charles's complete shock, Jeremiah grinned. It was small, barely there, but it was real. And for the first time, Charles felt something in his chest shift. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope. An unwanted visitor. The fragile peace didn't last. That afternoon, the knocking came again. But this time, it wasn't Jeremiah. Charles opened the door and immediately felt his stomach drop. Marcia Reed, Lila's sister. She stood on the doorstep, her coat dusted with snow, her arms crossed over her chest. Her eyes, so much like Lila's, burned with barely contained anger. "What the hell are you doing, Charles?" she snapped. Charles exhaled, already knowing what this was about. Marcia. Don't Marcia me, she hissed. I've been looking for him for weeks. And now I find out he's here. With you. Jeremiah appeared at the top of the staircase, his grip tightening on the railing. Marcia's face softened when she saw him. Baby, come here, she said, reaching out. Jeremiah hesitated. Charles felt his chest tighten. Marcia turned back to him, fury returning. I want him out of here. He belongs with me, not you. You don't get to play father now just because you feel guilty. Charles's voice turned cold. I didn't take him from you, Marcia. He came to me. Because he didn't know better. Marcia's voice cracked. Because she told him to. Charles stilled. What? Marcia's shoulders trembled. Lila, she whispered. Even after everything, even after you left her, she still told him to find you. Can you believe that? Her voice broke. She trusted you, Charles, even when you didn't deserve it. A silence so thick it could have swallowed them all stretched between them. Jeremiah's fingers curled into fists. I don't want to go. Marcia turned back to him, her face lined with pain. Baby, I promised your mom I'd take care of you. Jeremiah's voice was quiet, but firm. Then why didn't you come for me sooner? Marcia flinched. Charles took a step forward, his voice measured. We need to talk. Marcia wiped at her eyes. Yeah, she whispered. We do. A decision to make. That night, after Marcia had left with a promise to return, Charles stood at his study window, staring out at the snow-covered city. The past had come knocking at his door, and now he had to decide what to do with it. Upstairs, Jeremiah sat in his borrowed room, staring at his hands. This wasn't the end of his journey. It was only the beginning, a battle for love and belonging. Snow fell steadily outside the grand Whittaker estate, coating the world in a deceptive blanket of stillness. Inside, however, nothing was still. Not Charles's restless mind, not Jeremiah's anxious heart, not the past that had crashed into the present like an unrelenting storm. For the first time in 12 years, Charles Whittaker wasn't in control. He stood by the large bay window in his study, his hands wrapped around a glass of whiskey he hadn't yet touched. His gaze was fixed on the iron gates at the edge of his property, where just hours ago, Marcia Reed had stood demanding that Jeremiah be taken from him. He belongs with me, Charles. Her words rang in his ears, twisting like a knife. You don't get to play father now just because you feel guilty. But it wasn't guilt that made his chest feel tight. It wasn't guilt that made him pace the length of his study like a man trapped in a cage of his own making. It was something else, something he hadn't let himself feel in a long, long time. It was fear. He had spent his whole life building something unshakable. Wealth, power, distance. And yet none of it mattered when faced with a 12-year-old boy upstairs who looked too much like his mother. A boy who had walked through a blizzard to find him. A boy who, for the first time in Charles's life, made him want to be better. And now Marcia wanted to take him away. Charles gritted his teeth. Not this time. For the first time in years, he wouldn't run. He wouldn't let his past mistakes dictate his future. He would fight. For Jeremiah. For Lila. For the family he never thought he would have. A quiet storm. Upstairs, Jeremiah lay awake in the too-soft bed, staring at the ceiling. He had spent most of his life learning not to get attached. To homes, to people, to promises. People said things all the time. You can stay here. We'll take care of you. You belong with us. But those words had never lasted. Now Marcia was back. She had been his mother's closest family, but she had also let him end up in the system. It wasn't entirely her fault. Jeremiah knew the courts had their own rules, but still, she hadn't been there. Charles had been. That thought scared him. Because if Charles let him down too, it would break him. A knock on the door made him stiffen. Charles's voice came, steady but uncertain. May I come in? Jeremiah hesitated before answering. Yeah. The door creaked open, and Charles stepped inside, hands in his pockets, looking like a man who had too much to say and no idea where to start. He hovered in the doorway for a moment before finally walking to the chair by the window. "She's coming back," Charles said. Jeremiah tensed. "I know," he muttered, staring down at his hands. Silence stretched between them. Then Charles exhaled heavily. "I don't want you to go." Jeremiah's eyes snapped up. He studied Charles's face, searching for any sign that this was just another temporary kindness. He found none. "I don't want to go either," Jeremiah admitted, his voice quiet but firm. "But what if she makes me?" Charles leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Then we fight." Jeremiah's fingers tightened on the blanket. "You'd fight for me?" Charles nodded. "Yes." He expected skepticism, expected doubt. Instead, Jeremiah nodded back. "Okay." It was a simple word, but it carried the weight of an entire childhood, spent hoping someone would finally mean it when they said they would stay. Charles felt something settle inside him. This was the right choice. And this time, he wasn't going to fail. A legal battle begins. The next morning, Charles was already making calls before the sun had fully risen. His lawyer, David Thompson, was hesitant but professional. "This isn't a business deal, Charles. You can't just throw money at the problem." Charles clenched his jaw. "I'm not trying to throw money at it. I'm trying to keep my son." David was silent for a long moment. Then, carefully, he said, "You call him your son." Charles stilled. The words had left his mouth without thought. But they were true. "Yes," he said simply. "I did." David sighed. "All right. Then let's do this right." Marcia's ultimatum. That afternoon, Marcia arrived, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. She wasn't here for a fight. Not yet, but she was ready for a war. She sat across from Charles in the grand living room, her hands clasped together tightly. "I don't hate you, Charles," she said finally. "I just don't trust you." Charles leaned back, folding his arms. "I don't blame you." She blinked, caught off guard by the honesty. "I failed Lila," Charles admitted. "I failed Jeremiah. I know that. But I also know that he doesn't want to leave." Marcia sighed, rubbing her temples. "I just want what's best for him." Charles didn't hesitate. "So do I." Silence. Then Marcia turned to where Jeremiah stood in the doorway, watching them with careful eyes. "What do you want?" she asked. Jeremiah swallowed. He looked at Marcia, his mother's sister, the closest thing to family he had ever known. Then he looked at Charles. And for the first time, he spoke with absolute certainty. "I want to stay." Marcia exhaled sharply, her eyes filled with emotion. "This isn't over," she murmured. Then she left. Charles turned to Jeremiah, his chest tightening with something too big to name. "We're going to fight," Charles promised again. And Jeremiah, without hesitation, said, "I know. A home worth fighting for." Over the next few weeks, the mansion changed. It was no longer just a house. It became something more. The grand dining hall, once cold and untouched, became a place where breakfasts were eaten together. The study, once silent and empty, now had drawings pinned to the walls. The living room, once lifeless, became the place where Charles and Jeremiah sat by the fire, talking about Lila, about art, about life. Charles Whittaker had built an empire. But for the first time, he was building a home. And he would fight to keep it. The battle for Jeremiah. Snow blanketed the city in a hush of white, muffling the world outside the grand Whittaker estate. Inside, however, the storm was brewing. The custody battle had begun. Charles had spent his life navigating the ruthless corporate world, outmaneuvering competitors, and striking deals that left no room for second chances. But this wasn't business. This was his son. And for the first time in decades, Charles was afraid of losing. Sitting in his study, he thumbed through Lila's letters, each one an unopened plea from the past. The ink, though faded, still carried the weight of her heart. "Charles, I don't need your money. I don't need your name. But he does. He needs to know he wasn't abandoned. He needs to know he was wanted. Charles exhaled sharply, pressing the heel of his palm against his forehead. If only she knew. If only she knew how much he wanted to make this right. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Come in. Jeremiah stepped into the study, his small hands buried deep into the oversized sleeves of his borrowed sweater. His face was unreadable, but there was a hesitancy in his posture, a fear Charles recognized. What's wrong? Charles asked. Jeremiah glanced at the floor before looking up. What if they say I have to leave? Charles's stomach twisted. The truth was, he didn't know. No amount of wealth or influence could guarantee the outcome of a custody battle. But he would fight. That much he could promise. He met Jeremiah's gaze. Then we fight harder. Jeremiah nodded, but he didn't look convinced. And Charles hated that. Preparing for battle. The next morning, Charles's lawyer, David Thompson, spread out the case files across the polished mahogany conference table. We need to prove that you can provide not just financially, but emotionally, David said, adjusting his glasses. Jeremiah is a child who has been through significant trauma. The court will look at stability, history, and frankly, optics. Charles exhaled sharply. You mean they'll see me as a cold, unfit businessman? David didn't deny it. Marcia has a strong case, he admitted. She's blood-related, has a history of knowing Jeremiah, and she's been trying to get custody for months. The system is on her side. Charles clenched his jaw. And what do I have? David gave him a long look. You have him. Jeremiah, the boy who had walked through a snowstorm just to find him. The boy who had sat at his kitchen table, carefully sketching as if art was his only refuge. The boy who, despite his pain, still wanted to believe in family. Charles straightened. Then we build a case that's impossible to ignore. The pressure mounts. The press caught wind of the case far too quickly. Tabloid headlines screamed speculation. Billionaire's secret son, a scandal in the making. Charles Whittaker's guilt play. Does money buy redemption? Custody battle heats up. Who deserves the child? The scrutiny was suffocating. Paparazzi camped outside the mansion gates, their cameras flashing like lightning every time Charles or Jeremiah stepped onto the front steps. One morning, Charles found Jeremiah sitting by the window, his sketchbook abandoned beside him. The boy's small hands were balled into fists. They keep taking pictures, Jeremiah muttered, like I'm some kind of freak show. Charles sighed, kneeling beside him. They don't know who you are. Jeremiah turned, his eyes sharp. Do you? The words cut deep. For a long moment, Charles didn't speak. Then, quietly, he reached into his desk drawer. He pulled out a faded photograph, one he had kept hidden for over a decade. It was Lila, standing in front of a mural she had painted years ago. She looked so full of life, so bright, so unapologetically herself. Charles handed it to Jeremiah. This is the first picture I ever took of your mother, he said softly. She made me stop in the middle of the street because she wanted a picture with her art. Jeremiah's fingers trembled as he traced the image. She looks happy. Charles swallowed the lump in his throat. She was. Jeremiah stared at the picture for a long time. Then, slowly, he picked up his pencil and began to draw. Not the mansion, not the headlines, not the cameras, but his mother. And Charles knew, in that moment, that Jeremiah had already made his choice. Courtroom battles. The day of the hearing arrived too soon. Charles sat at the defense table, his fingers steepled together, his heart pounding like war drums. Marcia sat across from him, her face set with quiet determination. She wasn't the enemy. She wanted what was best for Jeremiah. But so did he. The judge, an older woman with piercing gray eyes, tapped her gavel. We are here to determine the best placement for Jeremiah Reed, she announced. Both parties will present their case. Marcia's lawyer was ruthless. She painted Charles as detached, unprepared, and incapable of providing the emotional security Jeremiah needed. She brought up his absence. She brought up his history. Charles's fists clenched beneath the table. Then it was his turn. He stood, adjusting his suit jacket. He wasn't going to win this with money. He had to be real. So, for the first time, he told the truth. "I walked away from Lila because I was a coward," he said, his voice strong but raw. "And I spent years convincing myself that I wasn't responsible for what happened next." The courtroom was silent. But when Jeremiah showed up at my doorstep, I had two choices. He looked directly at the judge. I could repeat my past and let him go, or I could finally be the man Lila always believed I could be. Charles turned toward Jeremiah, his heart in his throat. "I choose him. I will always choose him." The judge's gaze softened. Then, Jeremiah stood up. He was holding a letter. "I wrote this for the judge," he said. His voice was small, but unwavering. With trembling fingers, he handed the letter to the bailiff. The judge unfolded it and read aloud, "Dear Judge Morrison, I want to stay with Charles because he makes me feel safe. Before I found him, I was scared all the time. The foster home wasn't good. I ran away because I remembered what Mom said about Charles helping me if I needed it. Charles is teaching me that it's okay to trust people again. He hangs my drawings on the wall and asks about my day. He makes sure I have everything I need, just like Mom wanted for me. I know some people think Charles shouldn't be my dad because we look different or because he wasn't there before, but Mom believed in him, and now I do too. Please let me stay with him. Sincerely, Jeremiah Reed." A hush fell over the courtroom. Charles's throat was tight, his vision blurred. The judge folded the letter. She looked at Jeremiah, then at Marcia, then at Charles. After what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "This court grants full legal custody of Jeremiah Reed to Charles Whittaker." Jeremiah let out a small, choked gasp. Charles closed his eyes. Then, without hesitation, he opened his arms. Jeremiah ran into them, and for the first time, Charles held his son. Not just as a duty, not just as a responsibility, but as a father. And for the first time in his life, he realized this was the only victory that had ever truly mattered. A home rebuilt from ashes. The echoes of the judge's words still lingered in the grand marble halls of the courthouse. This court grants full legal custody of Jeremiah Reed to Charles Whittaker. Charles had spent a lifetime winning deals, contracts, acquisitions. But as he walked out of that courtroom with Jeremiah at his side, he realized this was the only victory that had ever mattered. They stepped out onto the courthouse steps, the cold winter wind biting against their faces. Flashes exploded around them. Reporters shouted questions. Camera lenses gleamed like sharp teeth, waiting to devour them whole. "Mr. Whittaker, what do you have to say about today's ruling? Jeremiah, how does it feel to be adopted by a billionaire? Is this just a PR move?" Charles clenched his jaw, glancing down at Jeremiah, who shrank slightly at the chaos. His small hands gripped the hem of his sweater, his face unreadable. Without a word, Charles placed a steadying hand on his son's shoulder. He turned to the reporters, his expression cool, composed. "This is not a PR move," he said firmly. "This is my son." Then he walked away, shielding Jeremiah from the storm of flashing lights and empty speculation. This was no longer their story to tell. It was his. The first day of forever. When they arrived back at the mansion, Jeremiah hesitated at the front door. "What's wrong?" Charles asked, frowning. Jeremiah bit his lip. "I just don't want to wake up and find out this was all a mistake." Charles's chest tightened. He crouched down, leveling himself to Jeremiah's height. "This isn't a mistake," he said, his voice steady. "This is home. Your home." Jeremiah nodded slowly, but Charles could see the hesitation still lingering in his eyes. The boy had been let down too many times before. Charles knew that trust wasn't something given, it was something earned, and he would spend the rest of his life earning it. Making a house a home. Over the next few weeks, the mansion transformed. It was no longer just marble and chandeliers, silent and untouched. It became something real, something alive. The grand dining room, once cold and unused, was now the place where Charles and Jeremiah sat every morning, eating burnt toast because Charles still couldn't figure out the toaster. The study, once a sanctuary of silence, was now filled with sketches taped to the walls, pages scattered across the desk, colored pencils rolling onto the floor. The living room, once a museum of lifeless furniture, was now where Jeremiah curled up on the couch, his laughter filling the space as he watched old animated movies with Charles, explaining every plot twist like a film critic. And the bedroom, once untouched and still, became his. One night, Charles knocked on the doorframe as Jeremiah sat at his desk, sketching under the warm glow of a reading lamp. "I have something for you," Charles said. Jeremiah turned, curious. Charles stepped forward and handed him a wrapped box. Jeremiah hesitated, then carefully peeled back the paper. Inside was a brand new set of art supplies. Professional graphite pencils, charcoals, a set of high-quality sketchbooks, an entire case of acrylic paints. Jeremiah stared. His hands hovered over the supplies like they were something fragile, something that might disappear if he touched them too fast. You got these for me," he whispered. Charles smiled. "Well, I can't have a son with a talent like yours and not give him the right tools, can I?" For a moment, Jeremiah said nothing. Then he launched forward, wrapping his arms around Charles's waist. Charles tensed, not out of discomfort, but because he wasn't used to this, to being held, to being trusted. Slowly, he placed a hand on the boy's back, returning the hug. Brick by brick, the walls between them were coming down. A world that still hates. But not everyone celebrated the victory. It started with whispers. Then the whispers turned to headlines. One morning, Charles opened the door to find his mansion defaced. Black spray paint covered the stone pillars. "He doesn't belong here. Utn'erase blood. A whitaker and a astret kid." Joke. Charles's blood ran cold. He clenched his fists, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had expected scrutiny. But this was hatred. Footsteps sounded behind him. Jeremiah stood there, his eyes widening at the sight of the hateful words. For a long moment, he just stared. Then he whispered, "I'll go pack my things." Charles snapped his head toward him. "What?" Jeremiah's voice was emotionless, like he was reading from a script he had memorized long ago. "This is how it always goes," he said. "People get mad. They say I don't belong, and then I have to leave." Charles saw it then. Not just the pain, not just the disappointment, but the expectation of rejection. Charles knelt down, gripping Jeremiah's shoulders. "You are not going anywhere," he said, his voice steel. "Do you hear me?" Jeremiah hesitated. "But—" "No buts," Charles interrupted. "This is your home. You belong here. And no one gets to tell you otherwise." Jeremiah's throat bobbed. He nodded, but Charles could see the doubt still there. And Charles was done with doubt. That night, he called a press conference, a public stand. Journalists filled the room, their cameras flashing as Charles stepped up to the podium. He didn't need notes. He had his truth. "I have heard the rumors. I have seen the headlines. And now, I have seen the hatred painted across my own home." His jaw tightened. "I will say this once, and once only." He looked straight into the cameras. "Jeremiah is my son." He let the words settle. "I will not justify it. I will not apologize for it. And I will not tolerate anyone who thinks they have the right to question it." Silence. Then a reporter called out, "But people say he doesn't belong in your world." Charles cut him off. "He belongs with me." His voice was iron. "And if anyone has a problem with that, they can go straight to hell." Gasps. Shock. But Charles didn't care. Because he turned to the side, where Jeremiah was watching from the wings. And for the first time, Jeremiah didn't look afraid. He looked safe. He looked home. A father's love. That night, as Charles sat in his study, he felt small footsteps approach. Jeremiah stood in the doorway, clutching his sketchbook. Charles raised a brow. "Can't sleep." Jeremiah hesitated. Then softly he said, "Can I sit with you?" Charles's heart clenched. He nodded. "Yeah, kid, you can." Jeremiah curled into the oversized armchair across from him, sketching silently as the fireplace crackled between them. Charles watched the flames. He had spent his life alone. But not anymore. Never again. Because Jeremiah was home. And so was he. The final bond. A father's legacy. The mansion had always been silent. Not peaceful. Not comforting. Just silent. For years, Charles Whittaker had walked its long hallways alone, his footsteps the only sound against the marble floors. His world had been filled with numbers, contracts, acquisitions, things that never asked for love, things that never left. And then Jeremiah happened. Now, the silence was gone. It was filled with pencil scratches on sketchbooks, the faint hum of music from the boys' room, the warmth of quiet conversations over dinner. It was filled with life. And for the first time in his existence, Charles wasn't afraid of the noise. But there were still battles left to fight. The shadows of the past. The morning light slanted through the tall windows as Charles sat in his study, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Across from him, his lawyer, David Thompson, flipped through a stack of documents. "This is about more than just custody now," David said, pushing a legal brief toward Charles. "Marcia may have lost the court case, but she's still petitioning for shared guardianship." Charles frowned. "What does she want?" David exhaled. "I don't think it's about you. I think it's about guilt. She believes she failed Lila. And this is her way of making it right." Charles leaned back, rubbing his temple. He understood regret. It had lived inside him for over a decade. But this wasn't about them. It was about Jeremiah. "What does Jeremiah want?" Charles asked. David hesitated. "That's the real question, isn't it?" A choice only he could make. That evening, Charles found Jeremiah sitting in the library, sketchbook open but untouched. The boy's fingers hovered over a blank page, his expression distant. Charles sat across from him, folding his hands. "Your aunt still wants to be part of your life." Jeremiah didn't look up. "I know." Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken emotions. Charles leaned forward. "What do you want, Jeremiah?" Jeremiah swallowed. For so long, other people had made decisions for him. Foster homes, social workers, courts. Now, he had the chance to choose, and that power felt almost too heavy to hold. "I don't want to lose her," he admitted. "She's the only family I had before you." Charles nodded, waiting. "But," Jeremiah's voice cracked slightly, "I don't want to leave." He finally lifted his gaze, and in his eyes, Charles saw something he hadn't dared hope for. Trust. "I want to stay," Jeremiah whispered. "I want to stay with you." Charles's throat tightened. Then he reached across the table, his voice steady. "Then that's exactly what we'll do. More than blood, more than a name." Weeks passed, and things began to settle. The estate no longer felt empty. Jeremiah's drawings covered the once bare walls. His laughter echoed through the halls that had never known joy. His presence filled the spaces Charles had never realized were hollow. But there was one last thing left to do. One night, Charles knocked on the boy's door. "Got a minute?" Jeremiah looked up from his sketchbook, nodding. "Yeah." Charles hesitated, then pulled something from behind his back. A small envelope. Jeremiah's brow furrowed. "What's this?" Charles handed it to him. "Open it." With careful fingers, Jeremiah tore it open. Inside was a legal document. His adoption papers. Jeremiah's breath hitched. His fingers trembled as he read the words. Charles Whittaker, legal father of Jeremiah Reed. Tears blurred his vision. "You want me to be?" His voice cracked. "Your son." Charles's own voice was hoarse but steady. "You already are." Jeremiah wiped his sleeve across his eyes, his heart pounding against his ribs. "Do I have to change my name?" he asked, barely above a whisper. Charles shook his head. "No, that's your choice." Jeremiah looked down at the paper again. Then quietly he said, Can I keep Reed? But add Whittaker." Charles felt something warm and fierce bloom in his chest. "You can be whoever you want, Jeremiah." Jeremiah's lips quivered. Then, suddenly, he lunged forward. For the first time, he didn't hesitate. He wrapped his arms around Charles's neck and held on tight. Charles froze for just a moment, then held him back. And for the first time in his life, Charles Whittaker didn't feel like a man drowning in regret. He felt like a father, a promise that could never be broken. The night before his adoption was finalized, Jeremiah sat on the back steps of the mansion, staring up at the sky. Charles sat beside him, their breaths visible in the cold night air. "Do you ever wonder what she'd think?" Jeremiah asked softly. Charles knew exactly who he meant. He exhaled. "Every day." Jeremiah hugged his knees to his chest. "I think she'd be proud of you." Charles felt his throat tighten. Of all the deals he had made, of all the riches he had amassed, those words meant more than anything. "I hope so," he murmured. Jeremiah leaned his head against Charles's shoulder. "I know so." They sat there, father and son, watching the stars stretch endlessly above them. A new beginning written across the sky. 1 year later, the community center was packed. Children ran through the halls, their fingers smudged with paint, their laughter echoing against the freshly painted walls. The once abandoned building had been transformed. The old peeling walls were now covered in art. The empty rooms were filled with life. And at the heart of it all, a mural. The hands of different colors, different sizes, reaching toward the sky. And in the center, a woman's face. Lila. Her eyes were kind. Her smile was soft. It was Jeremiah's greatest masterpiece. As the crowd gathered for the official opening, Charles placed a hand on Jeremiah's shoulder. "You ready?" Jeremiah smiled. "Yeah." Together, they stepped forward, not as strangers, not as obligations, but as family. Final lines. The mansion was no longer a prison of marble and silence. It was a home. The past was no longer a weight around Charles's throat. It was a lesson. And Jeremiah was no longer a boy looking for a place to belong. He was exactly where he was meant to be. Not just as Jeremiah Reed, not just as Jeremiah Whittaker, but as his son. And that was forever.